welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I know that we have participants from Australia to the Americas joining us here for our book club, IBIMD Book Club, and I'm delighted to see such a global audience coming to our session today because the topic is very much a global topic, a topic of global concern. Anyone who has ever played a Monopoly might be familiar with this process. At the beginning of the game, everyone has the same number of cards, the same chances, or so would it seem. And over the time of the game, we see a shift. We see things changing. We see that at the end of the game, no matter how long you play, for hours, for days, for weeks, everyone at the end of the game, there is one winner. And this winner will have amassed all the valuable assets. And most of the players will go out with some kind of meek result. Having observed this process for a couple of times, I was very much inspired and fascinated by a book that inspires us to think differently and do something about it. So it's my great pleasure today to speak about and speak with the author of the Cooperative Economy, Dovev Labi. Thank you very much for being here, Dovev.
Thank you very much, Katerina, for this pleasure of having the opportunity to visit IMD for the book club. Indeed, the Monopoly game is very joyful when you are a youngster, but as you become older and you realize that the economic system that you live and operate in is quite similar to this Monopoly game, it becomes less entertaining to operate in.
Yes. So Dovev, you are a professor at Bocconi University. You have a PhD from Wharton. You really think deep and hard about societal grand challenges that deal about value creation, value capture in alliances and ecosystems. And you wrote this book about the cooperative economy, and we're delighted to have you here to elaborate a little bit more. What are the problems? What are the root causes of it? Before we go into the conversation, I would like to encourage everyone to use the chat functions for your questions, comments, observations. The chat is enabled. I will try to monitor it and see to weave in your questions when I see them at a given opportunity. So, Dovev, maybe to start us off, what is the problem here? Why are we talking about this?
Yes, so well, the economic system in Western societies has many merits. It has shown great growth and productivity, efficiency, but in recent years we encounter many of the challenges and problems that are associated with it. So one of the problem has to do with the concentration of wealth and economic inequality. Today, about 1% of the population possesses about 46% of the wealth, and about 55% of the population have about 1.3% of the wealth, and this pyramid becomes more and more extreme over time. A decade ago, it was needed that you'll have 380 billionaires to have the wealth of the poorest half of the population, and a decade later, 26 billionaires would suffice. In the United States, 3 individuals have more wealth than the poorest half of the population. And it seems that this economic inequality has taken a toll. If you look at who are the winners in this monopoly game, these are mostly multinational corporations, and especially the big tech firms. I think that 5 out of the top 7 companies in terms of market cap are the big tech companies, and they were able to capitalize on this economic system at the expense of many other stakeholders. So first of all, they managed to drive out their competition using self-preferencing and other techniques, acquiring their more successful competition, etc. And even though it seems that they have been benefiting consumers in terms of the availability of products, services, and such, it seems that eventually these consumers have been left with fewer choices, and they are paying the high price, not necessarily with higher prices, but in fact with their private data. So related to this issue is the concern about data privacy, which becomes much more in the topic today with the emergence of artificial intelligence and other mechanized tools that are being used in digital platforms. So it seems that these systems know about us more than we know about ourselves, and we see that they are using these algorithms to convince us to purchase things that might not be necessary, to drive our choices, and eventually we seem to be losing our free choice in this economic system. And all of this system is geared toward more consumption and more production. And the problem that we face today, and it's quite known, is that we cannot afford it. We just don't have the sufficient natural resources to support this increased consumption. And globalization hasn't made things easier because it reinforces these other four problems, beside also pushing us toward a society that is more consumeristic, more individualistic, so it unstitches the fabric of traditional societies.
So we have a wealth concentration, we have an overconsumption, we have a grip of the platforms, we have the loss of privacy, and then the drawbacks of the globalization mean that this has been reinforced over the current years, right? So obviously this is a process that has been going on. So what do you think is really the root cause for it? Why do we see this exacerbating so badly in the moment that you felt the need to write a book about it?
Yes, well, if you ask most economists and policymakers what is the root cause, they will point to government policy, they will point to regulation and to corporate objectives and policies. But I think that the problem, the root cause, is much deeper. And it comes down to human nature, if you will, and the fact that this system is motivating and facilitating opportunistic behavior, which is driven by greed. And if we go and try to analyze each of these problems, we realize that the common theme is that in this system, there is a preference to pursue profit maximization and utility maximization at the expense of some societal values. So even though societal values exist, we all appreciate freedom and sustainability. The fact of the matter is that in many cases, when companies face a choice between pursuing the social good or pursuing the profit and utility objectives, they choose the latter. And this is the root cause, because the system, the principles of the system reinforce this choice.
That's interesting because the system is obviously based on human nature, right? So what does your solution entail? Do we change human nature? Do we change the system? What do you think is the good way to go?
Well, I don't think that we can easily change human nature. This is quite challenging, and therefore my suggestion is to change the economic system. So if we can modify the principles of economic exchange, we might be able to motivate more pro-social behavior and less opportunistic behavior. But the question is why the current solutions don't achieve that, right?
Because we have obviously regulation, we have antitrust, we have environmental policies. So why are they not sufficiently getting at the problem? Why is there still a problem, or why is it even getting worse?
Well, I believe that these existing solutions are trying to deal with the symptoms, not the root cause. They are at the surface of the problems and not trying to change the DNA of the system. Besides that, we see that most of these solutions are very focused on a specific type of problem. So either they're trying to deal with environmental issues, or they're trying to deal with antitrust challenges, or trying to restrain the big tech firms, which we've seen in recent years. But the problems are interconnected. And when you're trying to deal with one problem, you might amplify another. Take, for instance, the United Nations recent pursuit of the SDGs, and you realize that there is inconsistency between the objectives. So on the one hand, you want to limit consumption, but then you want to persist with quality and growth. It's inconsistent, and therefore you don't see any attempt to restrain consumption or limit consumption or productivity. The focus is on enhancing the efficiency of the technology, the productivity, but you can realize that it doesn't solve the problem. Let me give you an example. So if you are trying to advance policies for recycling, for instance, then eventually you see more plastic being used. Take the case of Germany, that is most advanced in terms of recycling, but also the consumption of plastic is the highest in that country compared to other European nations. So the issue is that the solutions, besides being limited, they are also inefficient. It takes many years to realize a problem, then takes many more years to craft regulation or change policies. And there are, of course, remaining loopholes. And by the time you are trying to apply these policies, the companies that are facing this constraint already found a way to bypass this. They changed their policies or business model. And they sometimes use these new policies in order to improve their position in competition compared to smaller companies, entrepreneurial companies that are not well equipped to deal with all this additional administrative burden. So the issue is that we have tried our best to deal with these problems with current solutions, but we see the results. The situation just gets worse.
Yeah, I think any system has to trade-offs that it manages, and any system has inherent imbalances that obviously lead always to adaptation. So complex adaptive systems always adjust to some extent. And you believe that the entire system is flawed, and we need to change the basis for the system?
Yes, let me explain why.
Yeah.
So we talked about government policies. The interest of governments is to see growth in GDP, to see improvement in the economic system. They don't want to see a reduction in consumption. They don't want to see unemployment. They don't want to see collapse of the stock market. So their vested interest is counter to the solutions that are currently proposed. There are, as you mentioned, inconsistencies in policies. Take companies. So companies also, they don't want to reduce sales profitability. They have commitments to their shareholders, employees. They want to support their companies to make sure that they have job security, their position is secured. Consumers, they don't want to reduce consumption, most of them. So if we are not dealing with the motivation, the essence of the problem, the root cause, it's unlikely that we'll see a real change in the system.
So now help us understand what could be really a shift here. What is the logic of your solution? Why is this fundamentally different? And what is at the root of it?
Okay, so let me explain that. As I mentioned, I'm not trying to change human nature. My argument is that the current economic system is not fully aligned with human nature. If we can try to shift some of the principles of this economic system, then we are likely to see a change because the system is, as I mentioned, pushing behavior. The system currently is giving advantage to those who pursue profit, utility at the expense of societal values. So what I argue is that when we revisit the principles of economic exchange, we see that human nature is not necessarily to increase profitability and utility. What humans mostly want is to be happy. And there are many ways to achieve that happiness that doesn't necessarily come at the expense of someone else. And to give an example, you can think, for instance, in Silicon Valley, there are established companies that are helping startups that one day would compete with them. Why do they do that? This seems to be contradictory to the current principles of exchange. And the idea is that there is a paid forward behavior. Some of these companies received support early on, and they have a sense of gratitude. They want to pay back to help others. And this suggests that not every individual and company are opportunistic in nature. Not all of them are trying to increase their wealth at the expense of others. Some of them are behaving in a way which is pro-social, which is the mirror image of opportunistic behavior. Pro-social behavior means that you are enhancing the welfare of others at a cost to oneself. The cost could be time and effort that you invest, but essentially you go counter to the very basic assumption in a traditional economic theory. And if you delve deeper into research in psychology, you realize that not everyone is opportunistic, but also obviously not everyone is pro-social. There is a distribution. So there is research showing that about 30% of us show high levels of pro-social behavior, this inclination to help others, to be cooperative. And indeed, about 23% are opportunistic, at least based on some experiments in economics. But most of us are conditionally pro-social. What this means? It means that if we observe that others in our environment are behaving pro-socially, they are cooperative, they're not trying to cheat and to benefit at the expense of others, they will follow suit. But if they see that the system is reinforcing opportunistic behavior, they are in a way forced to adapt with the norm. So
essentially what you're trying to create is a system that supports the proactive social behavior or even the opportunistically pro-social behavior. So this is the shift in the system incentives, or is this more on how does it work?
Okay, so the idea here is that on the one hand, we try to reduce the opportunistic behavior by penalizing it and trying to prevent opportunistic players from participating in the system. On the other hand, we are trying to reinforce pro-social behavior. So we don't need to reach all of the participants to behave pro-socially. We want to allow those who naturally are inclined to behave pro-socially to pursue their natural inclination. And the majority that are following the norms will adopt this pro-social norm. So we just have to reach this tipping point where we see that the majority are behaving pro-socially. So to set new norms in a way, if you want to show.
Yeah.
So
that would be interesting.
What we see here is my analysis of the problem, but also the path to solution, because in any economic system, you have two opposing forces. You have opportunistic participants on the one hand, and those who want to behave pro-socially. In the current economic system, we have the opportunistic players overpowering the pro-social ones. So we have gone beyond the tipping point where a pro-social behavior doesn't pay off anymore. All we have to do to solve these societal problems is to somehow design an economic system that gives an advantage to pro-social players and tries to drive out opportunistic behavior beyond a certain limit where we can see that new norms are being established.
And is this a disruptive change, or is this more a continuum? Is this modifying the current system? Do we have to think about it in a totally different way? How would you see this to come about?
Well, I believe that there are two ways to deal with the current problem. One is to witness the continuation of the ramifications of the current system until someone revolts, until we have a collapse of the current system, and then we'll figure out what to do. The alternative approach is to think a priori how we can build a new economic system that initially will grow in parallel to the existing system, so we can manage a transition of at least some of the participants to this new system. So what I'm suggesting is maybe revolutionary in terms of thinking, but not revolutionary in terms of implementation.
Let's get to what are the principles of your system, because I think there are some interesting points in there. So reading your book, honestly, I very much enjoyed it. You have principles such as community focus, respectful employment, consumption's only what you need. So those embed really these wonderful societal values that might be perceived as being quaint or almost old-fashioned, but those are wonderful societal values such as respect, fairness, and moderation, or temperance, as the Greek would have it. Those are wonderful. And then how do they come to play? Because I see you have a couple of other principles as well that might raise the one or the other eyebrow, right? Such as limiting earnings, for example, or what do you have, the incentives instead of restrictions. So how do your principles work in your system?
Okay. So as you mentioned, indeed, some of the principles would make sense because we are trying to implement them in the existing system, like respective employment terms.
Yeah.
But we've seen that in practice, there is the opposite trend. For instance, part of the problem is that in the pursuit of efficiency, we see that production is shifting from Western countries to more developed countries, but unfortunately the employees in these developing countries are not enjoying the same employment terms as in Western society. So we see that there is difficulty to implement this. But if we are trying to implement a system with all of its components, then we are able to find a solution that would reinforce some of this. So let me explain some of the basic principles. So the first principle is to shift from a global economy to a constellation of community-based economies. So instead of emphasizing the international trade and the efficiency of the system that benefits these multinational corporations, once you shift focus to the community, you're able to promote pro-social behavior, because within a community, you have individuals that share values, cultures, beliefs, they interact, they know each other, they are less likely to behave opportunistically toward their own clan, and therefore you are able to build an exchange which is more equitable. It doesn't mean that communities will not trade with each other, but when an individual consumer has a choice of buying a certain product, preference will be given to those who are more locally present, as opposed to buying from other communities. So it's essentially shifting the focus back to the community.
Yeah. Can you, I mean, we do see some of that in the moment already, right? So there's a trend to de-globalize, to fragment a little bit more. So how does this go in parallel? Is this something on top of what we've seen already?
Well, as you can see, and you mentioned, the trend currently is going in this direction
Yes.
because we realize that we reached almost the top in terms of how we can progress in terms of globalization and the reorganization of production and services across the globe. And now we are facing the challenges that come with it. So there is a natural tendency for people to move toward communities. So this is quite aligned, but this is not the end of it. One of the main principles is that of price subsidization. When we think about the efforts of governments to create a more equitable society, we see that they are using taxation on the one hand to take from those who have, and then different government subsidies and services that they provide to those who cannot afford. But the problem is that on the one hand, they reinforce the dependence of those in need on these services, on the system. They don't create independence. On the other hand, those who have, when they pay taxes, they are not necessarily happy with that contribution. This is why we see a lot of tax evasion, especially with international corporations. And in general, I think the support for the tax system is not high. About 70% of Americans do not believe in the tax system and those who operate because the priorities are not necessarily benefiting those in need. So what I'm suggesting here is that those who have higher available income would pay more for the same product and services as others are consuming within their community, and this will help subsidize those who have lower income available. The metaphor that I'm using is that of caffè sospeso, which comes from Italy, where you enter to the bar and you order coffee, but you pay for two, one for you and one for some other visitor to the cafe that will come later and will use it for free. So I'm not saying that everyone will get free coffee, but the idea is to somehow increase the price a bit for those who can afford it, reduce the price a bit for those who cannot. And this creates the benefit of pro-social behavior, because when you give to someone in your community, then you are enjoying the benefits of pro-social behavior, which is happiness, higher self-esteem, and general life satisfaction, which have been associated with pro-social behavior. So those who give enjoy some emotional benefits, and they are not necessarily suffering as most of us suffer when they have to pay their taxes.
Yeah, and I believe this is also a question of scale, right? So I believe most of us would love to help the needy and would love to support those who are in need. And yet at the same time, I would imagine looking at the principles you have here, subsidizing the needy and maybe also capping vendor earning might raise some eyebrows, because this sounds a little bit like communism, right? So why is your system not a communistic system, and how do you really balance that trade-off?
Before we get there, let me elaborate a bit more on the principles, because there are a few. You mentioned, for instance, caps on profit. So I agree with you that we don't want to create equal, let's say, purchasing power, like in communism. So you still want to have those who earn more to be able to purchase more, because otherwise they will not be able to subsidize those in need. So if you put limits to consumption, they should also not be uniform. So those who can afford this should have less limits on consumption, but currently they don't have these limits imposed. And this is one of the advantages of the system, because in the current economic system, even though there is a trend for more minded consumption, there are no regulations or any efforts to impose this. So you can try to nudge consumers by showing what are the consumption limits for different consumers. And the idea is that in terms of the prices, you have to set the prices so that they will still motivate those who earn more to earn more, and those who are receiving these discounts to not free ride the system. So I agree with you. It has to be balanced in a way. Now, you mentioned also the profit caps. There is nothing wrong in profit. There is something wrong with excessive profit, because at a certain point, when you want to make more profit, it reaches beyond moral boundaries. So if we take examples of companies like Meta that have a choice of whether to make more advertising money or actually make sure that their users are not suffering some social or psychological consequences,
Yeah.
they have the incentive now to disregard some of these societal concerns. But if you tell companies like Meta that beyond a certain limit, whatever you gain, you have to redistribute back to your consumers, it takes away the motivation to go this extra mile of exploitation.
Yeah. We have a couple of very interesting questions because, and it leads us to the next segment here, because I believe we need to gauge a little bit what's the dimension of what we're talking about. Who is the authority here? So if I summarize the question that I have, there's a fabulous question on how do you find fair value distribution, or how you should decide what will be fair. So that's because this is also some definition that we can weave into this. The second question, how much policymakers should be involved either as a participant or a promoter of the system. Rephrasing is how much the system depends on policymakers' acceptance, so that we have the societal component.
Maybe we can answer some of this. So
let's go. Okay, and then I move the next one from Pierre.
So there was the question about what is fair. How can we determine what is the right price, what is the right profit limit, what is the right consumption limit? So the idea is that in the current economic system, we have digital platforms that are using technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, algorithms, in order to maximize their profits. The problem is not with these technologies. The problem is what is the objective you give to these technologies to pursue. So my idea is to use the same technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., to determine what is this optimal level of prices, what is the optimal level of consumption limit or profitability that would create this balance and benefit the different stakeholders. So the answer will be driven by this technology, and as long as you set the right objective, this can be achieved. Now, the other question was
how much policymakers do you involve? That's the authority problem here.
Well, obviously, if you follow the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and all of the other, the B Corp, all of these efforts are relying on a collective in the government or in the corporate arena to drive change. And we see the limits of this approach because it's slow, it's very difficult to reach consensus, there are conflicting incentives. So my design here was to rely on government to the least possible way. So this is why we shift focus to communities, which are not only the beneficiaries of the system, but also they take responsibilities, and you shift focus to the communities. Now, with the help of digital platforms, you can set norms of behavior without the intervention of regulation. I'm not saying the regulation is not necessary or needed. It is, of course, helpful to have it, but as we see, it's insufficient. So we want to change the incentive system through economic exchange, which is powered by this digital platform, in order to drive participants toward these goals. So, for example, if you are creating a society where you improve the purchasing power of the poor, then the government needs to provide less services to this population. And maybe if you are limiting profits of companies, government will take less taxes on profits. So overall, the focus shifts from government and government policies to market mechanisms.
I believe there's also a definition what is community, right? So a state is a community, a collective is a community. So the question is, I think it's a question of gauging what is fair, what is community. There needs to be a proper definition of this. I have a question here from Pierre. I traveled to Bali and visited a local village. I understand that the small village functions in the way you describe, just that the reason they need the system is that the state is not providing any social security system, and the community has to provide that type of insurance. Do we want to go back to the 19th century? Thank you, Pierre, for the question.
Okay, that's a very interesting question. So it's quite broad in implications. So we don't want to move back. We want to move forward. And I think that even in countries that offer very elaborate support systems from the government, we see some of the limitations of this system. Take the United States, where we see some decline in parameters like life expectancy and other parameters, even though they have a very advanced system. So the idea here is not to go back in time, is to move forward and use technology in order to pursue societal values which are currently compromised. So it's a step forward, but in a different direction than where we are currently heading.
But technology is just supporting or amplifying a system, right? So there needs to be a qualitative change in the system for that to play out differently. Otherwise, it just accelerates it, no?
Right, this is the design principle. So the
Yeah.
design principles are flipping the logic of economic exchange, because the current economic exchange is how can I benefit myself at the expense of others? So how companies can benefit at the expense of suppliers, consumers. This is what we teach in business schools.
Yeah, I know.
So I'm arguing that we can try to flip this and think about how we can benefit others at a cost to oneself. And I'm claiming that doing so will actually create emotional benefits. And if you are spiritual, religious, then you might actually argue that it will create economic benefits, because the world will reimburse you for this effort in a way. But you don't have to be a believer to see the benefits of this system, because just purely based on psychology, it improves emotional gains. And my argument is that it will benefit more than those that it will limit in terms of consumption. Besides, all these top CEOs and companies, how much can they consume? At the end of the day, you can eat only 3 meals or a certain number of calories.
I believe there's something more to economic activity, right? So we challenge what is, inspire what could be. I think there's something more that CEO want than just having 3 meals a day, right? So that would be my cautious assumption here. But I would love to go to one more question here. I believe that the capitalista market already allows for less affluent to pay less and those richest to pay more for roughly the same product or service. Brands, for example, have value but not necessarily utility, and they are afforded by the wealthy, whereas the less wealthy use channels and solutions that are much cheaper. So I think there is something already represented in the current system that would match your principles, no?
Well, I think this reinforces my point, because I'm not reinventing anything. I'm taking principles that are already there and giving them more ground, more dominance. So price subsidization is being used by companies mostly with the purpose of benefiting the companies. But you can see companies that offer the same product at different prices in different geographical areas, that you can buy, as mentioned here, the product without the brand for a lower amount. And all I'm saying is, let's take this principle and apply it in a more comprehensive way, in a way which is actually more beneficial to society.
There's one interesting question, two more. To what extent is cooperative or corporate ownership structure beneficial or even required to reach the presented cooperative approach?
Okay, so this is a very interesting question of how companies should change. I think that there are already trends that we see that push companies to change their mission, their purpose, to be more societal focused, to promote the SDGs. So we see this effort already. The problem is that this is changing the components while the architecture of economic exchange remains the same. So this is why we see very few exceptions of companies that are able to pursue these purposes. Many of them are faking it in the sense that they would pursue it only if it indeed serves their profitability objectives and improves their position in the market, but they are not really driving change. What I'm suggesting here is to create this infrastructure that would motivate these companies to take this further. And actually it would fit very nicely within that system. So there are already companies that are donating, that are not trying to exploit consumers, that are trying to limit their profits and distribute it. This will just make it the norm rather than the exception.
Okay. So maybe we now move into how does it work? I've been really keen on how do we get this to work? What are the practical implications? I know that you have already tried to set up some experiments. Can you show us a little bit how this could actually come into being, just beyond the conceptual point of view?
So this sounds idealistic, like a theoretical idea, and the next step would be to prove or to try to prove that it actually can work. So let me perhaps start with a very simple thought experiment that we can run now here with our audience. And the question is, are really people that pro-social? Is it that indeed if we change the rules of the game, then we can see this change, or actually 90% of the population are opportunistic by nature, and therefore it's not going to work. So let's try to run this experiment, this thought exercise. And in the book, I encourage readers to actually try this in real, but we can do this as a thought experiment. So imagine that you are going in your hometown and you see someone that is a beggar in the street that asks for money, and suppose that he is really in need, that you believe that they are in need, and you donate to them $5 or €5, your local currency. And after you do that, you proceed and meet a colleague, a friend, a family member, and you ask them to give you $5 or euros, the same amount. The question is, which type of transaction made you feel better? The one where you were donating to someone else, or the one that you were receiving the same amount from someone else? So perhaps let's
And
take
I
a poll.
suggest we do the same thing here. So we have a similar poll. So think about that situation. Imagine you were in the opportunity, you have the opportunity to donate something to someone like $5. What would make you more happy, donating the money or receiving the money? You can see the results on the screen. We have 86% of 68% of you said yes, donating the money makes me much more happier than receiving money. Only 14% of you said that really receiving the money is making me happier. Does this concur with the results you had from your from other experience you ran?
Yes, actually, if you want to run this for real and then go on the book's website, you can cast your vote and see what the results are there, which are quite consistent. But let me play the devil advocate. Okay?
Okay.
So this is not representative because, first of all, many of the followers of this conversation are more affluent, they are managers, they're executives, they can afford it. We don't have people that are struggling in this poll. Second, there is self-selection here, because those who are interested in the topic join the conversation. Those who are more opportunistic, they don't have time for us. They are busy now making money someplace. So maybe the results will be different. So what I've done is to take it forward and run a more elaborate experiment in my university. So let me tell you a bit about that.
Just a minute, because there were a couple of questions here. So a comment is, change it to 50,000 and the result will change. That's interesting. What makes me happy is that I have the capacity to make others happy. For that, I need to have the $5 in the first place. That's a good comment, I think. And to have the $5, I need to have the ambition to earn them. They don't fall from the sky. Lastly, there's a comment there. There will be many trade-offs, and to decide on them, there will be many left-right decisions. Donating money means that you have enough money. And there was another comment saying 14% are struggling here. So maybe you can give your view on those comments.
This is fully consistent with my proposed system, because in my system, not everyone is donating. Only those who have a higher available income. So it's pretty consistent with this trend. Those who have less income are on the recipient side. They are being subsidized. But besides that, we want to examine these principles in a more realistic scenario. So what I've done in the past year is to design an experiment with colleagues where we were inviting Bocconi University students to purchase what we call brioche and coffee. So they had the opportunity to go to the university restaurant and purchase these items on a daily basis. And we created two groups. For one group, we set a fixed price, €3, regardless of what is your randomly assigned income. And then for the other group, we set the prices more consistent with the donation or the wealth that they received, the allocation of budget that they received. So we ran this experiment, and what we found is that by design, it improves economic equality. So those who had a lower income in this experiment were able to purchase more coffee and brioche, and those who had more income reduced somewhat their consumption, but we didn't see that they reduced their spending, whereas the supported, the subsidized participants didn't increase their spending substantially for the system to be imbalanced, and there were sufficient donations in this experiment to cover for the subsidized population, even though these participants could go and buy the coffee for the €3, the fixed price, not only in other places, but in the same restaurant, just not using the app that we developed. So there was a good response. The level of engagement did not decline compared to the control group.
Mhm.
And we've seen that this didn't come at the expense of community and other forms of donations. So
Mhm.
we allowed participants to do the café sospeso, so donating coffee to the community.
Mhm.
We allowed them to transfer items to their friends, to those in need directly.
Mhm.
And we've seen that the price subsidization didn't necessarily come at the expense of these other forms of donations, because one of the concerns is, okay, you are just changing
Yeah.
the way that
That you donate.
individuals
Yeah.
are participating
Yeah.
in these donations. But this was not the case. And the reason we believe is because once you make this pro-social behavior the norm,
Mhm.
then people are following the norm, sometimes without even making all these mindful decisions. Do I want to donate or not? Because with
Mhm.
every purchase, you are helping someone
Yeah.
in your community. And then it creates this reinforcing effect where you see that others are
Doing
donating,
it.
participating, it
Okay.
encourages you to
Mhm.
take part in it.
Mhm.
And eventually, we've seen that one thing that was clear is that the group that had this price subsidization, they were much higher, showed much higher levels of satisfaction than the control group with the fixed price, which is consistent
Yeah.
with the idea that pro-social behavior pays off emotionally.
Yeah. I think there was a nice comment here of, is it more rewarding to be needed or to need? I think that that's a little bit that goes along the same lines, right? Another comment is here. I guess you don't need to offer only money. I can offer a job instead of subsidizing people. How do you see this?
Well, I think that any kind of pro-social behavior that moves in the direction of benefiting someone in your community
Yeah.
is desirable. And in a way, the other interventions that I mentioned, like redistribution of profits or trying to limit consumption, in a
Mhm.
way, you are benefiting others because you're making these resources available for
To
someone
them.
else to
Yeah.
consume.
Mm-hmm.
You are redistributing value. So the underlying idea is that in the current economic system, the focus has been on value creation and capture. What we have here is a refocus on the idea of value creation and fair distribution. So we're not
Mm.
taking away the idea of we need to create value,
Mm-hmm.
but we need to be more mindful about how we distribute it in a more equitable way.
And I think that goes back to one of the earlier questions, what really is fair, right? So how do you define fair? And I believe we all have a maybe slightly divergent idea of what this could be, right? I see a couple of questions here as well. I believe we need to look at whether we agree on the starting premises. Some people believe that if someone does not have the $5 in the first place, it's because they did not make the efforts to earn it, while others believe the system is flawed, and when you start without the $5, it is very difficult to earn them. Depending your belief on it, you will be more inclined or not to give $5 in the first place. Would you
Okay,
support this?
as being a researcher, I would urge to not rely on beliefs, but to check the research. So clearly,
Okay.
there is research about discrimination and research showing that those who have wealth and power
Mm-hmm.
can have better opportunities.
Yeah.
You don't have equal opportunities. So if you can afford sending your children to top universities,
Mm-hmm.
then they are better off, even if they were as smart and on the paper they had
Mm-hmm.
similar opportunities. So it's true that you have these grants and you have all these scholarships, but this is exactly another form
Yeah.
of subsidization,
Yes.
which is what I'm
There's
trying to
another
establish
question
here.
here about the tax system in Europe, which is already high pro-social, 40% and more taxes. We spoke about Norway earlier. I would agree. I mean, taxes are basically also a form of donation, only that I'm forced to pay them, or I choose the country in which I pay. I love to pay taxes, and yet does it make me happy to pay taxes? Depends on the country I live in. I love to pay taxes in some countries and others not so much. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, as I mentioned, the subsidization is based on the available income. So it's after tax. So if you pay 50% tax, you have less available income.
Mm.
So this will be factored in. And I agree that these different countries will have different systems, but this system doesn't depend on the tax system applied. But in any case, as mentioned, most people will feel better donating to someone in their community than just paying taxes if they don't have much confidence in the tax
Or is it maybe
policy.
the voluntary choice that I make? I have a free choice to give or not to give. It's my choice. Taxes, I don't have so much choice, no?
Okay, let me give you an example. So when you look at progressive taxation, which is one of the solutions that was offered for this same economic problems that I mentioned, realize that there is progressive taxation, but those who are really at the top, they have the accountants and the skills to avoid taxes or
Mm.
to limit their tax contributions. And we've seen in the recent years that much of the tax burden has shifted from corporations and from top earners to families. So this
Mm.
is based on OECD data.
Mm-hmm.
And there is research showing that government policies are more consistent with the interests of those who have economic power than with the general community. So relying on the existing legislative system and the tax system and government policies, there is a reason why most of the individuals do not trust the system.
Mm. So we're anticipating let's say, the slight dissatisfaction with the current system in trying to find vents to shift it slowly before it disrupts completely or erupts completely.
Well, this is where you can rely on your beliefs about where we are going,
Yeah.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
there are those who believe that the current system is just great,
Mm-hmm.
and there are those who believe that is doomed to collapse,
Mm-hmm.
and there are those who are trying to fix it, and
Mm-hmm.
those who are trying to offer an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what we want to do is to give fair chance to all of these beliefs and test them.
Yeah.
So my next step would be to try to develop a prototype of the system, which is
Yeah.
much broader, more developed than this small experiment that I ran at Bocconi, and try to implement it in a real community
Mm-hmm.
and see how it works, how to tweak the different parameters. And this is where I turn to those who happy to pay taxes.
Yes.
If you have some spare money to donate to someone in need,
Yeah.
then I'm looking now to find the research budget and donations to promote this research further.
I have one more comment here that I would love to use to pivot towards one thing we hadn't discussed yet. There's a comment: we're too far from solutions, so I would love to go towards solutions, but they need to discuss these themes because all have increasingly becoming worse. In AI is a big risk to amusement of a system and risk to push us to even more inequality and extremes. So can we weave into the connotation of artificial intelligence, if you may call it, for this for a moment? How does technology support, hinder, help your system here? How do we think about this? And
Yes.
how do we drive really towards a solution that we can implement?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting conversation about the benefits and risks
Yeah.
of AI. But even though those who are developing these systems have some noble interest causes,
Mm.
the issue is that eventually we see that profit orientation takes over. If we follow
Mm-hmm.
what happened in OpenAI with the
Yeah.
changes in the board, for instance. So I contend that the technology is neutral. What matters is what are the objectives that you set. So as much as artificial intelligence can help human to be more effective, efficient
Mm-hmm.
in making profits,
Mm-hmm.
it can help society in striving toward the societal values. And of course, we need to test, experiment, because we cannot really use analytical solutions to foresee what will be the consequences of systemic change, because it's a very interconnected, complex system.
Yeah.
This is why we need experiments and to try to develop based on experience. So the idea is that the solution will be based on algorithms, and artificial intelligence, machine learning will be using to optimize the parameters
Yeah.
of that system. But where I think we do need government intervention is in somehow supervising and trying to check whether the system is pursuing its cause. So currently we have a regulation that tries to restrict misbehavior of big tech companies and deal with consequences.
Mm-hmm.
What we need is something different. We need to change the motivation of these companies so that they will have the incentive to serve the different stakeholders. And one way to achieve that is to move from regulation to inspection and certification. Because me and you, if we go into a big tech company and we see how they base their code and what the technological solution is,
Mm-hmm.
we cannot understand it. So you
Mm-hmm.
need experts that have the authority to inspect the algorithms of companies and certify whether they are serving societal needs or actually harming societal needs. I don't think it should come in the form of regulation that forces everyone to do it. It should be the interest of companies to subject themselves to this inspection and certification, like ISO 9000, in order to gain a competitive advantage in the market, to make their product more attractive to consumers. And this is where you align
Yeah.
the market incentives of companies with societal incentives, because
So,
currently they seem to be contradictory.
yeah. So even if there was someone who were to understand the algorithms, which definitely is not me, but let's say even if there was someone, most of these algorithms are basically IP of companies, of private companies, right? So both impose quite a significant problem to control AI. This is, I believe, the big discussion we have at the moment. How do we get this genie back into the bottle, I believe, right? Or if we don't want to have it in the bottle, what do we do with it so it
Yes, I
does
think
not.
this is a topic for the next
For the
book.
next book, yes, okay. All right. Okay. There's another interesting question. Do you think the system is capable to perform like the capitalism, which by nature forces competition and work commitment and so favors growth? So would this system favor growth and development as much as the current system does?
Very interesting question,
Mm.
and the answer is, I think, more complicated, because on the one hand, I contend that my proposed system provides more freedom and more competition than the existing model. On the other hand, it will not facilitate growth as much. So let me give you examples. So in the current economic system, if you want to compete against large multinationals, you have very limited ability. If you want to compete with Google, with Amazon, even if you have access to the technology, they have sufficient budget to either acquire you or to use advantages, self-preferencing, etc., to drive you out of the market.
Yeah.
So there is not really free competition. This is the end game of the monopoly,
Yeah.
if you
Yeah.
recall.
Yeah.
Also, as an individual, suppose that you want to pursue a profession of choice. Some professions in our economic system are not well rewarded. Take an opera
Yes.
singer, an artist, maybe at the top, they can earn well, but most of these individuals who want to pursue professions in the art have to end up doing some admin work someplace to make a living.
Yeah.
So there is even less freedom from the employment side. So introducing this idea of price subsidization allows those who usually earn less to have a greater purchasing power and therefore more freedom of choice. So I would argue that competition will increase with the system. Also, the motivation of individuals to invest in the employment sector will increase because they'll have more liberty to pursue their profession of choice.
Yeah.
So they'll be better motivated. In terms of growth, I think this is not a problem of the proposed system. It's a problem of the existing system, because the current level of growth cannot be supported by the natural resources that we have. It is well understood that we cannot continue on this path of increased growth. The question is, how do we degrow? Either it is because we'll reach the consumption limit, prices will increase so much that most of us will not be able to afford it, or it's because we'll run out of resources, or if we adopt a new mindset where we pay more attention to the social benefits as opposed to the consumption benefits, this will come naturally. So the system is not designed to educate companies and consumers to change their mindset, but it sets norms that nudge them to move naturally in that direction.
Interesting. So there's, I mean, there are a couple of assumptions that we have now built into this model. There's one comment that also hints at the transgenerational imbalance that we observed. A recent study shows that nowadays we cannot build wealth on a salary, in contrast to the 70s, but wealth increases rely more and more on previous assets, what you have inherited, etc. So our participant would agree that the tax system is supposedly subsidizing the less fortunate, but it does not allow to move on a social or the wealth ladder. That would support your arguments that the built-in inequalities are exacerbated over the generations to come, no?
On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, I'm not trying to deal with property and assets like you mentioned communism or other socialistic approaches. So the idea is to base the subsidization on available income, not on assets. So to leave assets in private hands. Now, you can argue that governments may want to touch that as well, and some governments do with inheritance tax, etc. And we see differences across countries, in Europe, for instance. So this system is not replacing these government policies and regulations. It's just another solution that's
Yeah.
supposed to help the economy move in the right direction,
Okay.
but it doesn't replace these other policies that also some of them have merit.
Okay. Uh, Pierre, you seem to think along. That's something where we discussed also when we prepared for this book club. We forgot that the development of many countries and a huge decrease in poverty is connected with international commerce. This village view is very dangerous and comes at the expense of the poor on earth. Rich communities will keep with themselves. Look at northern Italy or Spain. What do you say about this? How do, if you have this tribal system of communities, they will protect themselves against the poorer ones, right? So just the fact that we have community doesn't mean that they are more willing to share than those communities we have here already, right? So I think that's a
Yeah,
valuable.
well, there is this solution is based on research that shows, for instance, that individuals are much more supportive, pro-social, trying to pursue mutual support within their own community, and they are could be antagonists toward outside communities. So in any case, we are moving in the direction where you are benefiting those in your community, which is a natural tendency. So I think it's quite in line
Yeah.
with this approach.
Okay. There's one great question. Don't you think the system might create more lazy people?
As I mentioned, I think the opposite.
Really?
Yes,
All right.
because the question is what happens to those who are subsidized? Okay,
Exactly.
so those who are subsidized, if they're opportunistic, then they might free ride. But we are trying to limit their participation in that system.
How do you limit them?
We'll get it in
Yeah.
a moment.
Okay. Okay. Cool.
For most other participants, they will have this paid forward mechanism. So they will feel gratitude and would want to pay back to the community. So take for instance, if we go for coffee with our student, then with the system, I will pay more for the coffee. The student will be subsidized. 20 years moving forward, this student will be a full professor or a CEO in a company. I will be a retired employee, and we go to the coffee again.
Yeah.
So they will feel much more urge to subsidize those in need than otherwise. So it's a self-reinforcing system. And as I mentioned, because it gives more opportunities to pursue your career aspirations, it will come with more motivation. And if you have, as a small business entrepreneur, better chance of competing, getting market share in this system, then you'll be even more motivated. So overall, I think that the shift here would be from large multinational corporations to local businesses. I don't see a problem of less motivation here.
Yeah, we have a nice final comment because we're at the top of the hour. Very optimistic view of the human nature. Is this how you see human beings?
Well, this is a matter of belief now. So I want to believe that human nature is diverse, that not everyone is bad. That there are some people that are extremely pro-social, some that are opportunistic, but we should not follow those who are pursuing the opportunistic path. Let's create another path and see what happens. And as I mentioned, we don't need to convert anyone. We just need to have a system that is aligned with the natural inclinations of human beings. Let's try it, see if it works.
Wonderful. Let me close with Sophocles. One must wait until the evening to see how splendid a day it has been. So thank you all very, very much for your fantastic comments, for your questions. Thank you, Dove, extremely for being here. It was a fantastic, inspiring conversation. I think we all need to think a little bit more how we can change the system proactively, pro-socially in a more warmer world. So challenge what is, inspire what could be, and please have a look at the book. Thank you and have a wonderful week ahead. Have a wonderful time ahead. See you soon here at IMD. Goodbye.